In 1943, a new shadow appeared over the Pacific. Larger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything Japan had faced before, the F6F Hellcat stormed onto the battlefield, and Japan barely knew what hit them. American pilots called it a zero killer. But in Tokyo, confusion gave way to alarm. How had the underperforming Wildcat suddenly evolved into an apex predator of the skies? What secrets lay beneath the Hellcat's hulking frame that Japanese analysts failed to see until it was too late? This isn't just a story about firepower. It's about how Imperial Japan misjudged America's deadliest warplane and paid the price. Design revolution: how the Hellcat was built to kill the Zero. The Hellcat didn't begin as a clean-sheet design. It was born in the crucible of Pacific failure. As early dogfights proved the Wildcat's limitations, Grumman engineers went back to the drawing board with a singular mission: create an aircraft that could not only match the Zero, but destroy it in every metric that mattered in real-world combat. The result was the F6F Hellcat, a fighter that looked like a Wildcat's older, meaner brother, but packed a completely different punch. Armed with a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine delivering 2,000 horsepower, the Hellcat could hit speeds of 380 miles per hour, outpacing the Zero by a wide margin. It could climb faster, dive harder, and survive hits that would rip other fighters apart. The wings were wider, the frame thicker, the guns heavier. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns gave it overwhelming firepower, and its armor and self-sealing fuel tanks kept pilots alive. But it wasn't just about hardware. Grumman involved pilots directly in the design process. Every detail, from cockpit visibility to ease of maintenance, reflected battlefield feedback. This wasn't theory, it was survival-driven engineering. Japan's intelligence services, still focused on specs, initially classified the Hellcat as a minor upgrade. What they didn't realize was that the rules of air combat were about to change, and the Hellcat was writing the new manual. Engineering for victory: what made the Hellcat a different animal? At first glance, the F6F Hellcat might have seemed bulky and inelegant, especially when compared to the sleek silhouette of the Japanese Zero, but that bulk was by design. Beneath its wide fuselage was a new philosophy: win wars, not air shows. The Hellcat's rugged build made it nearly indestructible. Its reinforced airframe could withstand punishment that would snap lighter planes in half. Pilots who limped home with shredded wings or bullet-riddled cockpits called it a flying tank. It was forgiving, easy to fly, stable under pressure, and built to protect the man inside. The massive engine gave it superior climbing ability, and the thick armor around the cockpit drastically reduced pilot fatalities. Its high-wing loading gave it stability in dives and turns, enabling hit-and-run tactics that outmatched the Zero's tight but vulnerable turns. And unlike the Wildcat, the Hellcat had hydraulic landing gear, no more hand-cranking 29 turns mid-flight. On aircraft carriers, the Hellcat was a dream. It required less maintenance, handled better on deck, and took off with heavier payloads. These weren't just technical achievements, they were force multipliers. Japanese intelligence, relying on early skirmish reports, assumed the Hellcat would perform like the Wildcat. What they didn't anticipate was how its survivability, firepower, and raw speed would flip the balance of air power so fast they wouldn't have time to react. First encounters: Japan's dismissive reaction to a deadlier foe. When the Hellcat first entered combat in late 1943, Japanese pilots didn't flinch. Early engagements over the Gilbert and Marshall Islands gave little indication that anything had changed. Veteran Zero pilots saw the familiar stubby frame and believed it was another variant of the Wildcat, sluggish, slow to turn, and beatable in a dogfight. That assumption didn't last long. Initial after-action reports from the Japanese side described encounters with a heavier model of previous American fighter that could absorb more damage than expected. But the true shock came not in the aircraft's build, but its aggression. Hellcat pilots refused to play the Zero's game. They didn't turn. They dove. They climbed. They slashed through formations with brutal firepower, then disappeared before a Zero could even pivot. Still, the Japanese high command dismissed these reports. They chalked up losses to pilot error or bad formation tactics. After all, no American aircraft had ever consistently bested the Zero in one-on-one combat. Confidence remained high until the numbers started piling up. By early 1944, patterns began to emerge. Dogfights once dominated by Zero aces were now turning into lopsided defeats. The Hellcat was proving too fast, too strong, and too coordinated. But for Japan, the most dangerous flaw wasn't mechanical, it was mental. They were still fighting the last war, while America was already winning the next. Turning the tide. The battles that forced Japan to reevaluate. The tipping point came at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. What was meant to be a decisive Japanese strike quickly devolved into what pilots grimly dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 400 Japanese aircraft launched. More than 300 didn't return. The majority were shot down by one plane, the F6F Hellcat. Japanese analysts scrambled to understand what had happened. How had their elite aviators, trained for years and backed by once unbeatable machinery, fallen so quickly? The post-battle breakdown was brutal. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the ease with which Hellcats were sweeping them from the skies. At the center of it all was coordination. Hellcats didn't operate as lone predators. They flew in disciplined squadrons, executing tightly choreographed attacks. Thatch weaves, high-side diving slashes, and team ambushes shattered Japanese formations. Zeros, designed for one-on-one duels, found themselves hopelessly mismatched. For the first time, captured pilots and decoded communications revealed a shift in perception. Japanese officers no longer saw the Hellcat as a technical oddity. They now considered it a strategic threat. Memoirs from Japanese survivors speak of growing fear, not of the machine itself, but of the method behind its attacks. In the air, fear is fatal. And by mid-1944, even the most seasoned Japanese pilots were beginning to hesitate. Tactics over technology, how Hellcat pilots changed the rules. The Hellcat didn't win by being prettier or even more maneuverable. It won because American pilots stopped trying to fight like their enemies and started fighting smart. By 1944, US Navy and Marine pilots were no longer obsessed with dogfighting in the traditional sense. They didn't care about honor, elegance, or who could turn tighter. Instead, they perfected tactics that emphasized teamwork, altitude advantage, and ambush. Hellcat squadrons trained relentlessly on coordinated attacks and practiced disengagement as much as engagement. The famed boom and zoom tactic, dive in, fire, and climb out before the Zero could respond, became the Hellcat's signature. Unlike the Wildcat era, where survival meant improvisation, Hellcat pilots entered every battle with a playbook, and they stuck to it with lethal precision. Japanese commanders misread this as cowardice at first. They were used to one-on-one duels. So when Hellcat pilots disengaged and attacked again from above or behind, Japanese leaders saw it as dishonorable. But it wasn't cowardice. It was control. Controlled aggression. Controlled strategy. Controlled dominance. Even veteran Zero pilots began reporting a new phenomenon. American fighters that refused to play fair, yet kept winning. Hellcat pilots weren't just shooting down planes. They were rewriting the psychology of the fight. And Japan, still clinging to romantic ideals of aerial combat, had no answer for it. Intercepted truths. What captured Japanese reports really said. By early 1945, US intelligence had begun recovering a goldmine of Japanese communications, radio transmissions, field reports, and pilot debriefs that painted a far more revealing picture of how the Hellcat was perceived inside Imperial command circles. One decrypted report from Japan's 343rd Naval Air Group described the Hellcat not just as superior in speed and power, but as unrelenting in attack coordination. Analysts noted a worrying trend. Japanese formations were breaking apart under pressure before a single shot was even fired. Morale was faltering. Captured documents confirmed what Hellcat pilots had long suspected. The psychological effect of the F6F extended far beyond its mechanical capability. One Japanese squadron leader confessed during interrogation that his pilots felt hunted by the Hellcat. They arrive in silence, strike like thunder, and vanish before we can recover formation. Perhaps most damning was a classified training bulletin from 1944 that warned Japanese aviators of the Hellcat's growing dominance. It urged pilots to avoid engaging F6Fs alone and to use decoy tactics, an implicit admission of inferiority. The reports were clear. Japan's faith in its Zero had been broken, not just by performance gaps, but by repeated, humiliating failure in combat. The myth of Zero superiority had been shattered, and the Hellcat had quietly become the most feared silhouette in the Pacific skies. And the scariest part? Japan had no replacement ready. Psychological shift. When Japanese pilots began to fear the Hellcat. Fear isn't always loud. It creeps in, unnoticed, until it alters behavior. By mid-1944, veteran Japanese pilots began showing signs of a silent shift in mentality, a shift rooted not in defeat, but in dread. The Hellcat wasn't just beating them, it was haunting them. Reports from surviving Japanese aces revealed a sharp change in pilot attitude. Where once there had been bravado and overconfidence, there was now caution. Squadron leaders began altering flight paths to avoid Hellcat-heavy patrol zones. Entire engagements were aborted if F6Fs were sighted in large numbers. This wasn't cowardice, it was survival instinct clashing with fading morale. Pilots complained of mechanical inferiority, sure, but what dominated their remarks was the sheer relentlessness of Hellcat attacks. They described American pilots who were cold, calculated, and mechanical in execution. The thatch weave and boom and zoom tactics had done more than preserve lives. They had broken the traditional samurai-style mentality of Japan's elite flyers. One veteran noted, "We could no longer predict the Americans' next move. We feared even the approach." It was a stunning reversal. The same Zero pilots who once saw the Wildcat as sport were now second-guessing every move when facing the Hellcat. In the end, it wasn't about which plane turned faster. It was about which side believed they had already lost before the dogfight even began. Doctrine collapse. How the Hellcat exploited Japan's strategic blind spots. Japan's military doctrine was built on an idealized vision of warfare, personal valor, direct engagement, and fluid aerial dogfights. That vision, forged in the skies over China and early Pacific conquests, began to disintegrate under the weight of Hellcat squadrons that refused to play by those rules. The Zero had been built around that philosophy. It was fast, nimble, and devastating if the pilot could dictate the terms of the fight. But the Hellcat never let that happen. American pilots, armed with tactical superiority and coordination, consistently controlled altitude, angle, and engagement timing. This eroded Japan's ability to utilize its own strengths. Japanese training had not prepared aviators for this. Doctrine emphasized one-on-one encounters, sharp maneuvering, and prolonged dogfights. But the Hellcat's speed and firepower made those fights brief and deadly. Japan's failure to evolve its air combat philosophy, even as defeat after defeat piled up, became a strategic liability. Worse, the Japanese command structure resisted innovation. They saw tactical adaptation as deviation from honor-based warfare. That rigidity proved fatal. US naval aviators weren't bound by tradition, they were bound by results. The Hellcat exposed this flaw with ruthless consistency. Japan's planners failed to realize they weren't just facing a new aircraft, they were facing a new mindset. One that would adapt, innovate, and ultimately rewrite the rules of aerial supremacy in the Pacific. Legacy in the skies, the Hellcat's lasting impact on US air combat strategy. The F6F Hellcat didn't just win battles, it changed the way America thought about warplanes forever. Before the Hellcat, success in the air was often measured by sleekness, agility, or top speed. But the Hellcat's dominance proved something different. Survivability, firepower, and tactical cohesion mattered more than flash. In just over 2 years of combat, Hellcats claimed more than 5,000 aerial victories, giving them the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any US Navy fighter in World War II. But even more remarkable was what they inspired. Future aircraft like the F6F Bearcat and the FA-18 Hornet carried the DNA of the Hellcat in their bones: durability, adaptability, and pilot-first design. US Navy doctrine shifted to prioritize mission readiness and damage tolerance over purely technical specs. Grumman's legacy as the Iron Works became a badge of honor, and the Hellcat its crown jewel. In training manuals and debriefs, the Hellcat became a case study in what happens when aircraft design, combat data, and human psychology align perfectly. It wasn't just a machine, it was a battlefield philosophy made manifest. Even decades later, retired pilots speak of the Hellcat not just with nostalgia, but with reverence. It was a fighter that didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be lethal, survivable, and relentlessly American. And it was, in every sense. Final verdict: what Japan ultimately believed about the F6F Hellcat. By the war's end, the tone in Japan's surviving documents had shifted from analysis to resignation. The F6F Hellcat was no longer seen as a nuisance or even an equal. It was feared, respected, and finally understood for what it was: a decisive force that Japan could not match. One post-war interrogation of a former Japanese air staff officer summed it up plainly. The Hellcat changed everything. Once we faced it in numbers, we realized we had lost command of the air. Reports from the Japanese naval technical arsenal labeled the Hellcat as tactically dominant, noting its unmatched kill ratio and battle endurance. They acknowledged that it neutralized the Zero's greatest advantage: maneuverability. Not by outturning it, but by never giving it the chance to turn at all. It wasn't just the Hellcat's statistics that earned Japan's respect, it was what it represented. To the Japanese mind, it became the symbol of America's industrial power, tactical pragmatism, and relentless adaptation. It was proof that the enemy had learned, evolved, and outpaced them. In the end, Japan didn't lose to a better airplane, they lost to a better way of thinking about air combat. The Hellcat wasn't designed to be beautiful, it was built to win. And from the moment it took to the skies, that's exactly what it did. Be sure to subscribe for more untold stories of warplanes that changed history forever.